She was 42 years old the morning the landlord's men carried her furniture into the street and left her standing in 6 inches of snow with nowhere to go. Her name was Margaret Coyle, and in the winter of 1891, in a lumber and lead mining town called Iron Hollow, Missouri, her husband dead 2 years from a collapsed shaft and her small rented house lost to a debt she had never known he'd taken on. She found herself with nothing but a carpet bag of clothes, $7, and a widow's grief the town had grown tired of accommodating. When the cold drove her past the edge of Iron Hollow that same evening, she came upon a ruined stone chapel abandoned a decade before, its roof half-caved, its windows broken out, standing forgotten on a hill where the old Cornish mining families used to worship before the vein ran dry and half the town moved on. She meant only to shelter there through the worst of the night. She did not know, huddled behind its crumbling altar with frost forming on her breath, that something had been sealed there years before, waiting through a decade of silence, that would not only save her from the winter closing in around her, but would return to Iron Hollow a truth it had buried, unknowingly, since the day the chapel's doors were locked for the last time. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Coyle. If you are watching this from somewhere cold tonight, in body or in spirit, we want you to know we're glad you're here with us. Margaret had not always known hardship. She had been born Margaret Pengilly, the daughter of Cornish immigrants who had come to the lead mining country of southern Missouri in the years after the war, drawn by the promise of steady work in the deep shafts that honeycombed the hills around what would become Iron Hollow. Her father, Edwin Pengilly, had been a captain of the old country's mining tradition, a man who understood rock and timber and particular language of a mine's groans and settlings the way another man might understand the moods of an old friend. And though he never rose to great wealth in the new country, he raised his daughter with a Cornish miner's particular reverence for what lay hidden beneath the visible surface of things, for the seams of or that ran invisible through solid stone, for the caches of value that patient, careful work alone could uncover. Her mother, Eloan, had been the daughter of a chapel-going family, and it was from her that Margaret learned not mining but faith, and more particularly the small, unglamorous faith of a woman who kept a household running through hardship without ever once making a show of her sacrifice. The Pengillys had worshipped, in Margaret's childhood, at the very stone chapel on the hill above Iron Hollow that would, decades later, become her only shelter, a modest building raised by the Cornish miners themselves in the town's earliest days, built stone by stone with their own hands during the years the lead vein ran rich and the community felt itself, for a brief golden period, prosperous and permanent. Margaret remembered that chapel from her girlhood with a clarity that would later astonish her, the particular cool smell of its stone walls in summer, the way afternoon light fell through its narrow windows and laid bars of gold across the wooden pews, the sound of Cornish hymns sung by miners whose voices carried the same rough tenderness they brought to their underground work. She remembered, too, the chapel's beloved minister in those years, a gentle, scholarly man named Reverend Josiah Trewin, who had come from Cornwall with the first wave of mining families, and had served the congregation for nearly 20 years with devotion that made him, by the time Margaret was a young woman, something closer to a beloved grandfather than a mere clergyman to half the town. Trewin had particular passion, Margaret recalled, for the chapel's altar, a modest stone structure he had insisted on building himself with help from the more skilled masons in his congregation, taking evident pride in its construction in a way that seemed, even to a child, slightly disproportionate to its simple appearance. He used to say, when asked about it, that a proper altar should be built to last 1,000 years, built with the same care a man might put into a vault meant to protect something precious, a comment Margaret, young and unthinking, had taken for a minister's poetic fancy rather than the literal truth it would later prove to be. It was from her father that Margaret learned patience with hidden things, and from her mother she learned the harder patience of enduring hardship without bitterness, and from Reverend Trewin, though she did not fully understand it until many years later, she learned that the things built with the most care were often things meant to protect what mattered most. She married young, at 19, to a steady young miner named Thomas Coyle who had come to Iron Hollow from a neighboring county, and for many years theirs was an ordinary, contented marriage of the kind that draws little notice. Two people building a modest household on a miner's wages, weathering the lean years when the lead price fell and the flush years when it rose, never wealthy but never quite desperate either. It was in the early 1880s, as the richest veins around Iron Hollow began at last to play out, and half the mining families who had once filled the old stone chapel began drifting away to newer strikes in Kansas and the territories, that the chapel itself was finally abandoned, its congregation too diminished to sustain it. Reverend Truett himself, having died some years before, mourned deeply but already fading, as beloved old men do, into the softer edges of the town's living memory. The building stood empty on its hill, its windows eventually broken by weather and neglect, its roof beginning its slow collapse, and Iron Hollow, by the time Margaret reached middle age, had largely forgotten it existed at all, a relic of a more prosperous decade that few had reason to think about. Thomas Coyle died in the collapse of the Baxter Shaft in the spring of 1889, when 11 men crushed when a poorly shored tunnel gave way beneath the weight of the hill above it. A disaster to the mine's owner, a hard, close-fisted man named Elias Warwick, who had bought out most of Iron Hollow's independent claims over the preceding decade, blamed on the miners' own carelessness rather than on the corners his foreman had cut in shoring costs. Margaret, left a widow at 40, discovered in the weeks following her husband's death that Thomas had, in the last 2 years of his life, taken out a loan against their small rented house from Warwick's own company store, borrowing against future wages to cover a series of medical bills for a lingering illness he had kept largely private even from her, not one to burden her with worry on top of grief. She had not known the full extent of the debt until the company's agents arrived at her door with papers she barely understood, informing her that the house, technically owned by the company and merely rented to Coyles under an arrangement common to mining towns of that era, would revert fully to company control given the outstanding balance, and that she had 30 days to vacate. 30 days became, through a series of small delays and false hopes, nearly 2 years, as Margaret took in laundry and mending to scrape together partial payments in Warwick's agents, perhaps calculating that a slow bleed of what little she had was more profitable than an outright eviction that might draw unwelcome sympathy from the town, allowed her to remain as a kind of indentured tenant, always one missed payment from the street. That missed payment came, inevitably, in the brutal winter of 1891, when a stretch of bitter cold drove up the price of coal beyond what her laundry income could bear, and she found herself, on a gray December morning, watching 2 of Warwick's men carry her few remaining pieces of furniture out into the snow, while a company clerk read aloud, in a flat, unbothered voice, the notice of her formal eviction. The town of Iron Hollow, much change in character since Margaret's girlhood there, offered little comfort. Families she had known for decades found reasons to look away, some out of genuine helplessness in hard economic times, others out of quieter fear of drawing Warwick's disfavor onto themselves by sheltering a woman he had marked, however unofficially, as a debtor best made an example of. Margaret spent that first homeless night in the loft of a sympathetic farmer's bar a mile outside town, and by the second evening, with the temperature dropping further and no clearer prospect ahead of her, she found herself walking, almost without deciding to, up the familiar hill path toward the old stone chapel of her girlhood, drawn by some instinct she could not fully name beyond the simple fact that she knew its walls, however ruined, and knew it would at least break the wind. The chapel, when she reached it in the fading light, was worse than she remembered from occasional distant glimpses over the years. Its roof caved entirely on the north end, its windows nothing but jagged frames admitting the cold directly, its wooden pews long since scavenged or rotted where they stood. But the south end, where the stone altar Reverend Truett had so carefully built still stood beneath a portion of roof that had somehow held, offered a rough pocket of shelter from the worst of the wind, and Margaret, exhausted and half-frozen, settled herself against the altar's base with her carpet-bag as a pillow and her thin coat pulled tight around her, telling herself she would find some better solution once the worst of this particular cold snap passed. It was in shifting her position sometime deep in that first night, trying to find some configuration of her aching body that the unforgiving stone floor would permit, that her hand, searching blindly in the dark for a more comfortable angle, found what felt like a seam along the altar's base that did not match the mortar work elsewhere on its surface, a line too straight, too deliberate, running along one side of the stone structure roughly a foot above the floor. She did not investigate further that first night, too cold and too exhausted for anything beyond the animal necessity of enduring until dawn, but she returned to discovery the following morning with particular attention her father's mining instincts, dormant in her for decades but never entirely gone, brought naturally to any irregularity in stone. Examining the seam in the gray morning light filtering through the broken roof, She found that what she had felt in the darkness was indeed a deliberately fitted joint, a section of the altar's stone facing that had been cut and set separately from surrounding structure, so precisely matched the rest of the masonry that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically searching for it, and might well have remained undiscovered for another decade or more had a homeless widow not been driven by pure desperation to spend a night pressed directly against it, working with a flat stone she found among the rubble. Patient in the way her father had taught her patience with rock, Margaret spent the better part of that second morning working the loose facing free. And when at last it gave way, revealing a cavity built directly into the altar's base, she found herself looking at a small iron strong box, rusted but intact, and beside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a bundle of papers that had waited, by her calculation, very close to the 10. Years since Iron Hollow's mining fortunes had begun their decline, and this chapel had been left to the weather,